Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. For this episode, I read Adventure, the Atari 2600 at the Rise of Console Gaming. It's done by Jamie Lendino. This is a really fun book. It basically covers the history of Atari, and it doesn't quite go all the way to the very end where they are now, but it's still pretty good. It goes up to about the late 80s or so, and there's just a lot in this book. There's a lot I like, there's some things I don't like, and I'll try to go through those about as quickly as I can here. So what I do like is that each chapter is kind of like a new year, and it builds on the story of how Atari slowly grew as a company, and then eventually really grew like way too fast, and then sort of didn't want to really fully change, and got way too rooted in their really in their arcade roots, and didn't really do like anything that pushed the boundaries. I really like that this is named Adventure, because Adventure is one of those games where I think Atari could have broken out of their just, we're going to do arcade ports and that's what we're going to do. Adventure could have broken them out of that. They could have probably created, some kind of a mascot character, kind of like a Mario or a Sonic, but for whatever reason, they were pretty content in just doing, okay, we're going to port our arcade games and we're going to port other people's arcade games, and that is all we're going to do. And it eventually kind of led them to sort of where they were in the, not really in the early 90s, but mostly in like the late 90s, early 2000s, where they were really just a publisher at that point. They weren't really doing anything special, to be honest with you. They were really just putting out, honestly, like Dragon Ball Z fighting games, and they were just constantly re-releasing like their greatest hits. Whatever games they still had licenses to, they were just constantly releasing those on like these bunch packs and everything like that, like their Hall of Fame packages, which are fine. I mean, the Atari games are kind of timeless because you can pick them up and play them. Pretty much anybody can just pick them up. They don't require any real tutorial. It's just, you move your shape around or ship and you just shoot stuff. It's really not, there's not a whole lot of variety there. There are a few things where Atari could have broken out and done some other stuff, but they just kept doing the same thing over and over again. Really what this book goes through is, so it goes through a lot of a lot of what Atari did, and it goes through like some of the ups and downs for it as well. And mostly, I think the biggest thing that was kind of a miss on this and could have been done a little bit better was more talk about the third-party titles and how, it wasn't just Activision and Magic and Parker Brothers and those companies. There were a lot of really crappy games coming out. He touches on this a little bit, but I think Jamie could have explored this a lot more. I don't know what his time constraints or like his overall vision for the book was, but I think he could have expanded on some other ideas if he wanted it to be like more of a comprehensive history. Just from reading it, I think he only wanted to focus on Atari, but then he does bring in like the third-party titles. It's most likely he did that because they were made up of people that had left Atari because they weren't getting any credit or anything like that for the games they were making, and they were just bringing in a ton of money for Atari. There are a few things in here, especially when he talks about when Activision sort of was founded. The people that founded Activision went to Atari, like Ray Kazar, the person who was running Atari at the time, and said, we want fair compensation. They were making around like 20 grand as a programmer, and Atari was bringing in like hundreds of millions of dollars in profit. So there was a bit of a disparity in there. They were asking like to be credited in their games and that sort of thing. And for reasons known only to Ray Kazar, he thought, these programmers aren't any more important than the people on the assembly line. Which is kind of ridiculous to think, because the people on the assembly line were not programming the games or anything. For the most part, they probably didn't know how to do that, They could have learned, but they weren't. They were just building the cartridges. The programmers should have been paid more than what they were getting paid, and they definitely should have been getting credit. This was a very weird way of doing things, but it was just kind of the way Atari was, and it was kind of the way a lot of other people were at the time. So those guys went off, they formed Activision, and Atari sued them because they started making games for the 2600. And unfortunately for Atari, they didn't have really a claim anybody can make a game for it. What Atari really missed out on, and it's brought up very well here, that they lost control of the third-party publishers, and that led to their eventual downfall. There are a few factors in here that Jamie goes through that are all totally correct, and it's that Atari basically killed themselves off because they didn't do certain things that Nintendo would eventually do, and what a few other game companies would end up doing. So like your Nintendos and your Segas, they all got the third-party people on board, had them sign agreements so that all of their games were produced with sort of like that Nintendo seal of approval or the Sega seal of approval. I know it's seal of quality, but whatever. And Atari didn't do that for some odd reason. So if you see an Activision game, it'll just say Activision on it. If you see in a Magic game, it just says a Magic. And if you're unfortunate enough to find a Games by Apollo game, it's going to say Apollo on there, and just run away from it because it's going to be horrible. It's just the way it is. And I think that was probably one thing that could have been brought up more here, was that the third parties really just screwed Atari over. Activision's sales eventually surpassed Atari's, especially on the game front. They weren't making consoles, obviously. And once the game market crashed, you saw a lot of those third parties just go out of business, along with a lot of the competitors to Atari. They either went out of business or just got out of the console business altogether. I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but the book moves very fast. So once you get done with the third parties, then you sort of move on to, after he talks about the good third parties, then really, I'm going to stop bringing up the third parties here, sorry about that. But after that, he talks about how the arcades were declining, and how two games in particular really, really lost consumer confidence in Atari. And those are obviously Pac-Man and E.T. Pac-Man was the first because, and this is something I don't see brought up a whole lot, but Atari really went after everybody that was making a Pac-Man clone. They took them to court, sued the living hell out of them, and often they lost. Sometimes they made it, but it was just like you're wasting all this money fighting clones of this game, and you're not worried about the game that you're actually making. And pretty much now everybody's seen that version of Pac-Man. You're eating wafers, not pellets. Your Pac-Man only faces in two directions, either the left or the right. The ghosts flicker around the screen for some reason, and it's just really awful. He does explain kind of why the game is the way that it is. The person that designed it wanted it to be a two-player game, and Atari, sort of in their greed, they decided that it's just going to be out on the 4 kilobyte cartridge. And I think he used all of it, but still, they had an 8 kilobyte cartridge, which would have solved some of the problems. If you just look at the Miss Pac-Man port later on, that fixed a lot of the issues that were with Pac-Man. Only at that time it was way too late to really save the console in any way. Also, Atari never fully committed when they released the 5200. They were just releasing the same games essentially, but with graphical upgrades. And they just never said, okay, we're done with the 2600, we're just going to focus on the 5200. Even now you see certain consoles like when PS1 came out, there was still that overlap period between PS1 games and PS2. Same with PS2 to PS3, PS3 to PS4. You always have that sort of year and a half where they're still making games for the old console, but they're coming out on both. And I think Atari tried to do that, but they never really went all the way where they were like, okay, we're done making games for the 2600. Here's the 5200. This is the way that you guys need to play them. Also, with the way that systems were at that time, customers weren't ready to just be like, okay, so the old system's done now, and the software for the old system isn't compatible with the new one. And that really messed with like the consumers and everything. They didn't want to just jump over to the new system. Nintendo kind of had a bit of this problem when they went from the NES to the Super NES to the SNES, but it eventually caught on where it wasn't that big of a deal because they were releasing newer and newer games for it. Sega sort of did this with the Master System and the Genesis, but they did release like an add-on. Atari did the same thing. They released an add-on that would let you play 2600 on the 5200, but it just was too late at that point, and consumers at that were too new to the console market. Were like, no, we're not doing this. And at that point, you also had like a huge flood of systems come out. You had the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, you had Fairchild was still going on in this point, and you had all of the home console, or the home computers as well, were starting to get cheaper, more affordable. Including Atari's 400 and Atari 800 home computers, they were getting cheaper as well. And people were like understandably saying, why would I just buy like a dedicated home console when for a little bit more money I can get a home computer that can do more? Now you don't really have that problem, but back in the 80s, these things were really expensive back then. Granted, the prices were coming down, but still, it was just a lot of money to drop on, just a dedicated home console that's probably only going to get played by your kids, and maybe the parents will play it every once in a while. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. And, it's kind of weird when you look back on these things. And like near the end of the book, Jamie gets into like how they could have released the 7800, which probably would have fixed some of the issues with, the 5200, but by this time Atari had been split up and sold because they just were losing a ridiculous amount of money. I think they lost around $500 million in 1 year, which is definitely not good, especially for the early 80s. And when the 7800 came out, it was still using technology from the 2600, particularly the sound chips, even though Atari had better ones that were already being used in the 5200 and also in their home computers as well. But because Jack Tramiel was, I guess, kind of a cheapskate, he didn't really want to, put those newer chips in there. I really don't know why. But the 7800 had graphics that were close to the NES. I would need somebody that knows more about technology to get in there and really tell me like what the specs are for it. I know the sound chip was inferior, it had backwards compatibility, but it just couldn't do anything compared to what the NES was doing. It was also just basically was running on a name that was really damaged at that point. Atari had done a lot of harm to themselves, especially with Pac-Man and with E.T. Everybody knows about E.T. at this point. It's not an awful game. It's definitely not the worst game of all time, but it's not a good game in its own right. It's confusing and probably way too ambitious for what the 2600 was. Anyway, those are pretty much all the things that I kind of like about the book and like a brief rundown. What I don't like about the book is the number of game reviews that Jamie has in here. I know what he's doing. He's using those games to like advance the story, say these are the games that released in this year, these are the games that released the next year, this is how they were improved upon, that sort of thing. These are the games that were made by a third party, and this is how like they were kind of better than Atari was, how particularly these two third parties, Magic and Activision, were kind of, thumbing their nose at Atari. Say, look at the great things that we could have been doing if you had just, played ball with us and, actually cared about your employees at all. And they just didn't do it. And, yeah, that's when you had a Magic and Activision sort of saying, hey, look, we're awesome now. What the hell happened to you? And yeah, it's kind of a weird story, but yeah, aside from the fact that there are just so many game reviews in here, I think if those have been tampered down and certain other parts of the story had been expanded on, I think this would have been an amazing book instead of just a great book. But it's two different opinions here, so my opinion on the book is definitely different from Jamie's. After all, he wrote it. But overall, yeah, it's a really great read. It was really fast. I did not expect to read it as quickly as I did. But yeah, I mean, here we are a week after the last one, and I've already finished another book. So, hooray! Anyway, so let's that's pretty much it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you like the video, give me a like. If you hated it, definitely tell me what you hated about the video. Especially since I've just been kind of rambling on for a while here. Anyway, the next book that I'm going to read is 8-Bit Apocalypse, The Untold Story of Atari's Missile Command by Alex Rubens. I don't know why I'm on an Atari shtick lately, but it's just kind of the way it is. Yeah. So anyway, I hope you guys have a great day, and see you all later.